Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how? Are you still alive? Patient stabbed himself in the neck with a thermometer that pierced his trachea. Missed all the important arteries, carotids, vertebrals, just hit some minor nerves. Good guy patient, provided his own temperature reads until they removed the thermometer. My dad's a doctor, so I asked him. When he was an intern in the someone walked in the front door with a kitchen knife sticking out between his eyes to the handle. The knife went through his sinus cavity and ended with the tip in his throat, millimeters from his brainstem. He goes into surgery and walks out of the ICU the next day. My dad says he is the luckiest man he ever saw. I had a guy with a Bowie knife sticking out of his chest. The knife was pulsating. I could literally count his pulse from across the room. Hemoglobin of 35, 3.5. In a 35-year-old guy with a chronic rectal bleed he refused to have looked into for months because he didn't want anyone looking at his bumhole. Finally brought to the by ambulance when he fainted. Aka started dying in a grocery store. Guy had an argument with his girlfriend, wanted to leave the apartment. Instead of taking the door, was real angry and jumped off the balcony, fell down 40 feet directly on his heels on cement. He ended up having an ankle sprain. I wondered how he managed previous issues in his life. Guy comes in with a bit of chest pain. Tells me the big coronary artery on the front of the heart was 100% blocked. I tell him, who told you that? He says his doctor did about 10 years ago. I don't believe him, since patients never ever get any of the stuff their doctor tells them right. I'll let the cardiac surgeon know what this guy said, and he too goes haha 100%, so he's dead. If the biggest coronary artery is totally occluded, and for 10 years no less, you are a dead man. Lo and behold, we get an angiogram, and it was king 100% occluded. The artery on the back of the heart made a connection with the front of the heart to pick up the slack. It was some lucky. I used to work as a clerk in diagnostic imaging at a hospital, and we had a man come in for an x-ray complaining of chest pain. His records showed his last visit was 2 years prior, when he got drunk and fell into a fish tank, breaking it. ER stitched him up and sent him home. Fast forward 2 years, and we are all gathered around the computer screen looking at an x-ray that showed a 12-inch long piece of fish tank glass sitting in his chest, with his aorta resting right on top of it. It was on an angle running from his left shoulder down towards his right hip. There were other shards of glass too, but this one was the biggest. Emergency surgery happened right away. Had a patient come in confused and delirious because his kidneys were shutting down. He had multiple myeloma and a history of colon cancer plus a bunch of other things. He was jaundiced and needed to be shocked several times. The physicians, residents, and even the family thought he was going to die. The man insisted on full measures to keep him alive. He recovered in the span of 5 days. His kidneys improved, his delirium evaporated, and the man king walked out of the ICU. Then there was the guy who had to be castrated, but that's another story. About 20 years ago, I had a patient come in with obstruction of his colon by a large colon cancer. The cancer had spread to his liver, and CT scan showed the liver basically replaced by metastatic tumor. So he wouldn't die on intestinal obstruction. I won't go into detail, but trust me, it is a very unpleasant way to die. The patient, his family, and I decided to try placing an expandable metal stent through the tumor. It worked. His obstruction was relieved, and he was able to go home to spend his last days with his family. 18 months later the patient came in for an office visit for heartburn. He was even more jaundiced than when I first met him, but he felt basically well and was eating well. The stent was still functioning. I never saw him again and assume he finally succumbed to his disease, but he got at least 18 months of precious and really good time. A patient I took care of had a car fall on his face. He was underneath it working when it slid off of the jack. The only reason he survived was because he broke every bone in his face. He had a left third, which allowed for his brain to swell. He also needed an additional surgery to relieve the pressure of cerebral edema, but the facial fractures did allow for a great deal of give in his skull. I was rotating through ICU, so I first saw him just a day after the accident. His head was so swollen, he didn't even look human. Fast forward a few weeks later, I was rotating through a different unit in the hospital and came across the same patient. He was quickly recovering and had minimal neurodeficits. Edit. For patient privacy purposes, I cannot give the age of the patient or location of the accident. I'm also not disclosing how long ago this was for the same reason. And of course I do not have photos. As for minimal neurodeficits, I saw this patient very briefly a few weeks after the accident. At that time, he still had edema and was in the process of getting better every day. I use that wording considering the severity of his injuries. He still had progress to make, but was able to walk and talk, had no memory deficits, not including immediately after the accident and his time in ICU, of course. I did not follow his care all the way through to discharge, so I don't know what he was like then, or in the months following the accident. I wouldn't be surprised if he went on to go to college and is living a normal life. He was a younger patient and younger brains tend to be more plastic, in that they can recover from injuries better than someone who is older. Edit 2. A few people have asked why they don't break facial bones as a last-ditch effort to relieve brain swelling. They do break the skull, just not the facial bones. They can make small holes called burr holes, or if the swelling is really bad, they can temporarily remove entire pieces of skull, a craniotomy. Sometimes pieces of skull are stored in the abdomen to keep them alive, so that they can put them back later. Not a doctor, but been a paramedic 15 years. Had an 8-year-old kid on a ripstick, similar to a skateboard, lose control and roll into the path of an oncoming SUV in his neighborhood. He was hit by then run over by it. We arrived to find him face down under the vehicle, unconscious, barely breathing. After all was said and done he had bilateral femur fractures, one lower leg fracture, multiple rib fractures, a blown pupil, and open skull fracture, subdural brain bleed, a tension pneumo, air escaping lungs into the chest cavity, will squish the lungs and heart if untreated, and when we were bagging him, breathing for him, we felt subcutaneous emphysema, free air that crackles like Rice Krispies / bubble wrap, in his hip. Yes, hip. We flew him to the children's hospital expecting him to die within the hour. He was in a coma 4 days and had to have multiple surgeries, but made a complete recovery. 100% neurologically intact as well, and graduates high school in the spring. His was such an amazing case the hospital made him one of their Miracle Kids of the Year. Parents, please make your kids wear helmets. Even in the neighborhood. It wouldn't have prevented all of his injuries, but would have substantially lessened the brain trauma he suffered. They got his age wrong in this. Not a doctor, but encountered a woman that was shot blank in the head by her boyfriend. Bullet entered one of her eye sockets and exited above her and ear on the same side. She called 911 on her own and survived, was in ICU 4 weeks, and testified against the bastard who is now thankfully in prison. Nurse here. 50-year-old male came to the ER after falling and not being able to get up. His testicles were so engorged they came down to his knees with a width 1.5x greater than his thigh. Penis was completely retracted into his scrotum. Had a CT scan that showed his entire large intestine, most of his small intestine, and his pancreas had herniated into his scrotum. You could auscultate his bowel sounds through his balls. The surgeon said she had never seen anything like this, and that it takes months to get that way, and only happens in third world countries with poor/no access to medical care. She couldn't do much, because his diaphragm had become so accustomed to the altered space in his abdomen, that if she put his organs back in his abdominal cavity he wouldn't be able to breathe independently, would need to be ventilated permanently. The poor guy had mental health issues, I believe schizophrenia, which is why he was in the condition he was in. He was still able to pee all by himself. Third time I post this story, but copy paste from myself. Story time first, some backstory. In Brazil, you can do internship way earlier than in most of America and Europe med schools, so keep that in mind. I was in my 4th year of med school, and in the first day as an intern in a trauma hospital, after training. There was a bus crash right before, so all the staff was occupied, when a woman came in screaming, "I'm going to die. I got shot in the head." When I look up I see a really thin woman, deep eyes, white as snow skin, with a bullet hole in the center of her forehead. She told us she owed money to a drug dealer, and he put a gun against his head, shot and ran. Now, I believe because she has burn marks and gunpowder right there in her skin, and a hole. Now remind that I'm a student, and there was no available doctors in the moment. So I run to my professor, that was with another patient, and tell her story, and also that she is lucid, with normal life signs, and get her order, to do a CT scan. The CT shows that the bullet entered the forehead trough, the first layer of the frontal bone, but not the second, and headed down trough palatus, traught and stopped at a vertebra, C5 if I recall correctly. No brain damage at all. So we intern her, and a tracheostomy is put in place, along with emergency reconstructive surgery, only a first, not definitive approach, along with a cervical collar. After she is stable, 3 hours later in her room, 3rd floor, we go down to see other patients. The emergency then gets a call. Hello. We are from the X hospital, 20 kilometers away from ours, and we found a patient of yours in our emergency. Then the nurses on the floor realized she was missing. She jumped a 3rd storage floor, broke her ankle, and got in buses, and went the other hospital. Why? I saw him in here. He came to finish the job. And before you ask, yes, some people lost their jobs. TLDR, shot in the head, patient could walk, talk, scream. As a very junior doctor, I looked after this mega alcoholic who needed ascites, fluid in the abdomen, caused by liver failure, tapping out every month or so. He kept coming in a worse and worse shade of yellow/green, jaundice, needing more and more fluid removed, still merrily drinking all the while. Well, the obvious happened. He died. Now he dead. So I wander onto the ward a few weeks later, to find him sitting there in bed, green as you like, looking very alive. Turned out his was his twin, also an alcoholic, also not to live much longer. Pathologist here had a guy who had died suddenly and unexpectedly. I soon learned he was the recipient of a lung transplant about 15 years prior. When I opened the man up, his transplanted lung was upside down. I flipped the lung into the proper position, and bloop. It flipped right back to upside down. That was quite alarming. The surgeons who originally performed the transplant incorrectly attached the organ. When he by chance entered the correct position, the lung flipped over, causing his pulmonary artery to seal shut, resulting in his death. The man lived for 15 years with a lung that was dying to flip upside down. And it was only by sheer chance he didn't move in such a way that allowed it to do so until the fateful day of his death. It is one of the most fascinating cases I have ever witnessed. Had a gentleman in his late 50s come in with multiple myeloma. Short history of progressively worsening breathlessness. Turned out he had a pulmonary embolism, blood clot in his lungs. He was a good candidate for surgery, so he had the blood clot removed, but unfortunately the clot had caused such bad issues with his heart, acute right heart failure, that he couldn't be weaned off the bypass machine. Instead, he went to ICU on ECMO, like a circuit for your heart and lungs outside the body, to give your heart/lungs time to rest. His chest was still open, cannulated centrally, but covered up with sterile stuff. After 3 days, he was booked to be weaned off the ECMO or at least have the tubes put in peripherally so his chest could be closed. Morning of the procedure, while he's waiting to be moved, somehow the tubing of the ECMO machine broke, oxygenator tube, and blood spilled all over the floor and he went into cardiac arrest. The cardiothoracics consultant had to do internal cardiac massage, basically CPR on the heart, by squeezing it via his still open chest, until the circuit got fixed, and he returned to a normal circulation. He ended up going to OT, and having his chest closed, but he had more clots pulled out of his pulmonary arteries. Clots had recurred. At this point I thought this guy was utterly kid. I figured if he even lived long enough to be woken up he'd have some degree of ischemic brain injury. After about 2 weeks the guy left ICU and a week later went to rehabilitation. Speaking, walking, cognitively largely intact. It was one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen during my short career.